Beginning in 1954, the Civil Rights Movement was a revolutionary time in American history. The story of how the Civil Rights Movement was sparked relates to a Supreme Court case and a tragic death. In 1954, the Supreme Court ruled in the case of Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. The famous organization, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored Peoples, or NAACP, began an effort to integrate schools by the 1940s, when Charles Hamilton Houston argued that the goal of the NAACP should be to integrate schools as children are the future. This was in response to Walter White's notion that the NAACP should pursue anti-lynching legislation. For a generation, Houston built a case against segregation in schools, training the ambitious Thurgood Marshall. Linda Brown was an African-American girl who had to travel to a segregated school every day, even though she lived next to a white school. Due to this, her father, Oliver Brown, decided to sue the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. Their attorney, Thurgood Marshall, had been trained for years for a case like this one. As a result of the ruling in favor of Brown, the Supreme Court effectively overturned Plessy v. Ferguson, which contained the infamous catchphrase of "separate but equal." In 1955, tragic news struck the nation. Emmett Till, a 14-year-old African-American kid from Chicago, had been lynched in Mississippi. Till came from a middle-class family that had moved from the South to the North, as many African-Americans did. During a trip down south to visit his relatives, he was accused of whistling at a white woman named Carolyn Bryant. 4 days later, Till was kidnapped, beaten, shot in the head, and his body was tied with barbed wire to a cotton gin fan. His body was then thrown into the Tallahatchie River. Although two suspects, the husband of Bryant and his half-brother, were arrested and charged with murder, the two walked free and even admitted to murdering Till later that same year. Till's mother decided to hold an open casket funeral for her son, so images of her son's mutilated body circulated all over the country. Suddenly, this Southern problem was an American problem. After Till's murder, more and more challenges to segregation began to pop up across the nation. For example, on December 1st of 1955, Rosa Parks refused to move out of the white area of a bus to allow a white person to sit down in Montgomery, Alabama. She was arrested, which produced outrage among civil rights activists and the black community. Black communities got together and agreed not to use the bus. Instead, they would walk or carpool with friends. This put massive economic pressure on the bus companies and Montgomery merchants because they no longer had as many people coming downtown to shop. Blacks went to local stores near their homes instead because it was harder to get downtown without a bus. By 1956, the Supreme Court declared segregation illegal on buses. In 1955, the Supreme Court decided a case known as Brown v. Board of Education II that provided rules for the implementation of the ruling in 1954. Despite this ruling, many communities did not comply, and by 1957, only 634 of the 3,000 school districts that were segregated had begun to desegregate. For those that did integrate, many white parents took their children out of public schools and sent them to segregation academies, private schools that could be selective in who they admitted, funneling funds from public integrated institutions to these private schools. At Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, the integration did not prove easy either. Orville Forbes, governor of Arkansas, had ordered the Arkansas National Guard to prohibit black students from entering the high school. The Eisenhower administration did not want to address the issue of integration, but by September of 1957, they needed to take action. The Eisenhower administration did not want to address the issue of integration, but by September of 1957, they needed to take action. Forbes refused to stop the obstruction of Central High by angry white mobs. Therefore, federal troops were sent in to facilitate the process. And on September 25th, black students were finally able to enter Central High School. This event showed the power struggle between state governments and the federal government when it came to the issue of desegregation and race. In 1961, the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, began organizing interstate bus rides to protest segregationist policies regarding public transportation. Students and veteran civil rights activists participated in this peaceful protest that aimed to uphold federal anti-discrimination laws. On May 4, 1961, the first Freedom Rides occurred. 13 riders took 2 buses starting in D.C., ending in New Orleans. The group bought tickets for a long bus ride that went through southern states, ignoring Jim Crow laws. The protesters were aware of the grave risk they were taking. Some protesters were arrested in Virginia, while farther south in South Carolina there was violence and more arrests. In Anniston, Alabama, a mob arrived and a bus was firebombed, although the injured were not allowed medical care. On the second bus headed to Birmingham, the protesters were attacked by the KKK and the police. With this increased violence came increased media coverage, so Attorney General Robert Kennedy sent an assistant to Alabama to keep everything under control. Having made their mark, the Freedom Riders flew to New Orleans for a civil rights rally. SNCC sent replacement riders that were arrested once they arrived in Birmingham. Martin Luther King Jr. thought the project was too risky and just led to more violence. However, SNCC planned another ride for May 19th, but the drivers feared for their lives, so they wouldn't drive. The JFK administration found a driver, and the National Guard for Alabama and Mississippi were forced to protect the riders, or else JFK would call federal troops. More rides occurred until the fall of 1961. On May 29th of 1961, the Kennedy administration ordered the Interstate Commerce Commission to actually comply with federal law and integrate public transportation. The Freedom Rides were officially a success. Around this time, Malcolm Little, or as he called himself, Malcolm X, was gaining popularity. Having gone to jail for burglary, X converted to the Nation of Islam while in prison. The Nation of Islam, led by Elijah Muhammad, believed that the black race was the first creation of Allah and that whites were devilish in nature. Groups like the NAACP and CORE were now at odds with the Nation of Islam. X believed that nonviolence was not enough to reach their goal of equality and that black independence was the solution, as African Americans could not depend on whites to give them rights. This did not mean he encouraged violence, according to him. Rather, he encouraged self-defense. X became a huge figure in the Nation of Islam, but by 1961, his popularity began to decline after a comment surrounding JFK's assassination upset Elijah Muhammad. In 1964, X left the Nation of Islam, although he still believed Muhammad's idea was, quote, most realistic. In April of 1964, he left for Mecca and formed the Organization of Afro-American Unity in June of that year, in an effort to unify all African Americans no matter what philosophy of protest they believed in. However, in February of 1965, X's house was firebombed, and a week later he was murdered by a group of black Muslims. In 1963, MLK and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, worked with the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights, ACMHR, to boycott businesses in Birmingham during Easter season, as it was a busy time. Originally, the protest was planned for March, but on April 2nd, Albert Boutwell, of racial moderate, had won the election for mayor against Eugene Bull Connor, the segregationist. Two governments were now battling for power in Birmingham, each ruling separately, and each refusing to step down. On April 3rd, desegregation campaigns began, including meetings, sit-ins, marches, and boycotts. As MLK preached nonviolence, more and more protesters got involved. On April 10th, an injunction was released against the protests. Leaders of the campaign decided to go ahead with the protests even if they were arrested, even though they lacked the funds to bail everyone out. King decided to still join to not lose credibility, even though he was needed as a fundraiser. On April 12th, MLK was arrested due to the injunction and placed in solitary confinement. While in prison, he wrote the famous Letter from Birmingham Jail, which was published in Birmingham News after a group of clergy denounced the protests. In it, he defended the campaign, disagreeing with the argument by many, including the Kennedy administration, that the protests were ill-timed. On April 20th, MLK made bail and was finally released. James Bevel of SCLC decided that to keep the movement going, using children as protesters was the solution, as they don't have the same responsibilities as adults. On May 2nd, the Children's Crusade began when more than 1,000 students marched and hundreds were arrested. Violent images of students being hosed down went viral and sparked international outrage. On May 10th, negotiations between Black leaders and Birmingham businessmen came to an end. There would be employment opportunities. There would be no more whites-only signs in restrooms and water fountains or segregation at lunch counters. Employment opportunities would be improved for African Americans. Protesters in jail would be released on bond, and a biracial committee would make sure the agreement was fulfilled. Despite this victory, segregationists reacted with violence. An explosive was detonated outside the motel where King and SCLC had stayed. MLK's brother's home was bombed, and the KKK bombed the 16th Street Baptist Church, killing 4 young girls. But the movement went on. A. Philip Randolph, founder of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, began planning a march on Washington for jobs and freedom. He had organized such a march in 1941, but when President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed an executive order that made discrimination in defense industries illegal, Randolph agreed to call off the protest. However, little had actually changed, and as images of children being hosed down in Birmingham circulated around the world, he decided to organize a new march in the summer of 1963. The purpose of such march was to increase awareness surrounding a civil rights bill the Kennedy administration planned to pass. This bill included job training and ending job segregation, and finally the true integration of schools by the end of the year. However, the administration tried to talk the organizers out of it, as they believed it would be better to stay quiet so the bill would pass. But the march went on, and Kennedy was forced to support the march. When August 28th arrived, 250,000 protesters arrived, a fourth of them white. Famous musicians like Bob Dylan, Mahalia Jackson, and Peter, Paul, and Mary performed. Incredibly moving speeches were made, including the famous I Have a Dream speech by Martin Luther King Jr. The march left the world with a unified image of blacks and whites and pressured the government to actually get stuff done. As fights for equal rights in employment were beginning to make progress, others worked on voting rights. By 1962, only 6.7% of blacks were registered to vote due to literacy tests and fear of violence by whites. In addition, there was lots of economic oppression in the black community. In 1964, the Mississippi Freedom Summer Program began. Black and white students volunteered to advocate African American voter registration, establish freedom schools, and get the black community involved in local politics. It produced a strong and violent response from Southern whites. A leader in this movement was Fannie Lou Hamer, a civil rights and women's rights activist. As founder of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, Hamer worked to register voters, even getting beaten and arrested in Winona. As a result of such violent resistance, President Johnson enacted the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which gave protection to blacks who were trying to exercise their right to vote. He even went so far as to permit federal intervention in making sure all were granted the right to vote. Voting in the African American community in Mississippi increased from 6.7% to 60%. In 1964, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act, which had been originally proposed by JFK in 1963. President Johnson, however, pursued the passing of the bill, although he had not initially been a supporter of the civil rights movement. He was opposed by Southern senators who thought such bill was a way for federal government to meddle in state governments. But LBJ was able to garner enough support so that the Civil Rights Act was passed on July 2nd of 1964. The act included various sections. It made attempts to bar voting rights illegal. It stopped segregation in public areas. It once again affirmed the desegregation of schools, and it made workplace discrimination of minorities illegal. Although many believed it was not tough enough, it altered everyday life in Southern communities and forced many states to change their segregationist systems.